Hitler's Nazi cult was built on the myth of racial purity. Family background was critical. The Führer's followers had to prove they came from solid German stock. But while others were excluded and eventually murdered because of their family backgrounds, the Führer's family was a mystery. It turned out that his ancestors were far from the ideal of the superhuman Nazi master race. Hitler himself declared, "These people cannot know who I am. They cannot know where I come from and what family I descend from."
When it came to family, Hitler had a lot to hide, more than he even knew.
Hitler's half-brother, Alois, was a bigamist. His sister Paula was engaged to a mass murderer. His niece took her own life. A distant cousin was murdered by his henchmen. One nephew was sacrificed on the savage Eastern Front. Another declared war on him.
I hope to take an active part in the liquidation of this man, my uncle, who has unleashed such misery upon the world.
By Nazi standards, Hitler's family tree had suspect roots. The dictator systematically covered up his ancestry. Even today, very little is known about his immediate relatives. While much information has been suppressed or lost over time, historians are piecing together intriguing details. The dictator, obsessed by racial purity and superior breeding, was himself the product of a dubious, dysfunctional background.
When you start looking at the family history, it really is quite remarkable how much there was that could be unpacked. And I think the only way he could deal with this was to put a lid on top of all of it and keep it hidden from public.
The Führer may have hidden his family secrets from the public, but it seems that even Hitler's past wasn't immune from the probing tentacles of the Nazi secret police. In January 1944, his private secretary, Martin Bormann, received an explosive document from SS chief Heinrich Himmler. It was a secret file about the Führer's relatives. Himmler had ordered the Gestapo to get to the bottom of rumors that Hitler had relatives in Graz, in Austria. Nazi agents found some of the Führer's relatives and described them as half-wits and the insane. It was an outrageous allegation. It's not known if the Führer was aware of the Gestapo investigations into his Austrian roots. The investigation led SS agents to the Veit family home in Graz. They confiscated photographs and documents, including personal letters from Hitler's father. Their conclusions were political dynamite. The Veit family was directly related to Adolf Hitler. And shockingly, there were cases of insanity in the family. Those cases included Hitler's cousin, Aloysia Veit.
Bei der Familie Veit fällt auf, dass
What becomes apparent about the Veit family is that the siblings also showed signs of mental illness. This family had problems. And if you look further back, there are more signs of psychiatric abnormalities among their ancestors. It begs the question if there was a genetic tendency towards psychiatric illnesses in Adolf Hitler's family.
Zum Ausbruch psychiatrischer Erkrankungen geführt hat.
Hitler's cousin, Aloysia Veit, was a schizophrenic. She was locked away in a mental institution for many years, until she became one of the tens of thousands of disabled and mentally ill people the Nazis deemed unworthy of life. Like many of them, she was sent to the Hartheim institution.
Hartheim was one of the facilities, one of the so-called clinics, to which children and later adults were transported in grey buses, having been selected by panels of doctors and social workers and psychiatrists, people who were deemed life unworthy of life, people who couldn't function, who couldn't perform useful tasks, they could not work. And on that basis, it was decided to murder them. It was called euthanasia.
Hitler's schizophrenic cousin, Aloysia Veit, was murdered in the Hartheim gas chamber in December 1940. But there was another critical question hanging over Hitler's family that couldn't be eradicated in the gas chamber.
Ich kann nur das deutsche Volk bitten, dass es niemals auf diese dummen und blöden und schwinghaften Phrasen dieser internationalen Weltjuden eingeht.
As the Nazis emerged from obscurity in the 1920s, Hitler's political opponents began to question his family origins, particularly on his father's side. Rumors circulated that Hitler had Jewish blood.
Of course, this would be dynamite for the man who so hated the Jews to have Jewish blood. This would sort of wreck his whole policy of anti-Semitism.
When Hitler's background was called into question, he turned to the man who once lived here, the genealogist Karl Friedrich von Frank. Frank reconstructed Hitler's family tree going back several centuries. Hitler was satisfied and allowed it to be published. He wrote to Frank saying, "As far as my sister and I can tell, this is quite correct." But the genealogist made a critical error, including the name Salomon by mistake. Hitler's opponents seized on the Jewish-sounding name. Newspapers splashed lurid stories about Hitler's possible Jewish roots. Jewish gravestones were shown with surnames similar to Hitler. And it turned out that the name Hitler was popular among the Jewish population of one part of Poland. Von Frank's family tree did little to stem rumors of Jewish blood in Hitler's family.
Frank, in his report, says there might have been a link between his mother when she was a servant in a Jewish house. That was where the link came, but it was never really proved. But it's never gone away. People are still saying maybe there was some Jewish blood in Hitler's background. That's why he worried about it. He worried about it all the way through the time he was Führer.
Numerous Jewish Hitlers emigrated to America in the early 20th century. Their names were recorded in the Ellis Island archives of immigrant passenger lists. But what of the extensive research carried out by Hitler's genealogist? The most comprehensive documents about Adolf Hitler's ancestry were hidden after the war, crammed into a sewer pipe in 1945. A few years later, they were stacked away in the corner of a hidden room behind the library shelves of von Frank's stately home. The surviving fragments were painstakingly cleaned and pieced back together in the Bavarian National Library. Historians re-examined the evidence. They didn't find any indications of Jewish ancestry in Adolf Hitler's family. But Hitler's ancestors were hardly the paragons of perfect Nazi breeding. His mother and father were distant cousins. Their families had been closely related for generations.
In small villages, there was intermarriage between various parts of the family. This was kind of where people chose their sort of marital partners, especially in small rural villages in Austria or, say, Germany at this time.
But for the local priest, Hitler's mother and father were too closely related. They were married only after special dispensation from the Vatican. Their son, Adolf Hitler, was born in 1889. His grandparents lived in the same village of Spital. They shared the same ancestral lineage. It was this family that produced a child responsible for perhaps the most monstrous chapter in human history. And from the city of Frankfurt, a spectacular record has emerged that casts an intriguing new light on the mother's boy who became a mass murderer and led the world into war. The new information has come from a woman with a remarkable story. She claims to have been adopted by Hitler's half-brother, Alois. She wouldn't reveal her real name, and changed her appearance. But she did reveal an amazing record of Hitler family history. In 1945, Alois Hitler and his wife Hedwig allegedly fled Berlin and made their way to Hamburg. They were allocated living quarters in the port city. Hitler's brother and wife eventually adopted their widowed landlady's daughter. It was this woman who agreed to go before our cameras.
We were told that he was Adolf's stepbrother. We caught wind of some of the story, but we were just told never to mention it to outsiders. I always think of him as a slender, grey-haired man with a moustache. It was funny that he had the same moustache as Adolf.
But for Alois, sharing looks and the name of the Nazi dictator became a burden after the fall of his half-brother's Reich. Alois Hitler changed his surname to Hiller, but he couldn't escape the past when he made the most of being half-brother to the almighty Führer.
It was a bit of a love-hate relationship, but he wasn't proud, otherwise he wouldn't have hidden away in Hamburg like that. I don't believe that he was proud.
After the war, 2 other members of the Hitler family joined Alois and his wife Hedwig in Hamburg. It was reportedly Adolf Hitler's cousin Hans and his wife Erna. Auntie Erna wanted to write a book about the family and used Hitler's half-brother as a source.
She was clever enough to ask him about details, which she then used in her manuscript.
Erna's 400-page family chronicle was never published. Now we can reveal its compelling contents. Many supposed records relating to Hitler have been faked. In this case, the paper and typeface were examined and found to be authentic. The manuscript begins with Hitler's childhood in Braunau am Inn, Austria. His father was a customs official, proud of his job, but rough with his family. Erna Hitler wrote that Hitler's father beat young Adolf and that his mother shielded him with her body. The future dictator developed a close bond with his mother.
He was very close to her. He was actually a classic mummy's boy. He didn't like his father. His father was very stern towards him and beat him, and he went for refuge with his mother.
His father collapsed over a usual morning glass of wine in a pub in 1903. His mother, Clara, died of cancer 4 years later.
The thing that summarizes Hitler's relationship to his parents best is the one sentence in Mein Kampf in which he says, "I respected my father, but I loved my mother." In fact, the word respect is the key element there, because that is what ultimately shaped Adolf Hitler's character and made him who he was.
Like his father, Hitler became intimate with his relatives, with tragic consequences. Hitler rented a holiday villa on the Obersalzberg near the picture postcard spa town of Berchtesgaden. His half-sister Angela looked after the household and brought her daughter Gaily with her. It was a fateful decision. Uncle Adolf was taken with his young niece.
This was certainly a very strange relationship. I mean, she was his niece. She lived in his house because his sister was his housekeeper. He seems to have become infatuated with her. He may have contemplated sexual relations with her, but we don't know whether that happened. But certainly the relationship was very, very close, very intense.
Gaily accompanied her Uncle Adolf on his travels now and then. Those travels included official party events like his rousing speeches at the Berlin Sportpalast. Gailey was impressed with her Uncle Adolf's popularity, but suffered from his controlling behavior. According to his cousin's wife, Erna, he constricted her personal life. She didn't know how to get out of it. She didn't even trust her own mother. She moved into Hitler's upmarket Munich apartment, but it was a gilded cage. Seriously depressed, she called Hitler a monster. No one can imagine what he demands of me. In September 1931, Gailey was found dead in her uncle's apartment. It seemed she had shot herself with his pistol.
I think we can rule out murder because Hitler had gone to give a speech in Hamburg the day before and certainly was in Hamburg at the time that she killed herself. So I think we can rule that out. But I think that the pressure that he was putting on her, the possessiveness towards her, there's no question that that was a factor in her suicide.
Hitler managed to avoid any serious political scandal. Gailey's mother remained loyal to her half-brother. As Hitler became more powerful, he spent more time at the former holiday home that would become his headquarters in the Bavarian Alpine region of the Obersalzberg. Crowds of admirers and Nazi followers flocked to the area. Fences were erected around the so-called Führer territory. Neighbors, like innkeeper Karl Schuster, didn't like the sudden influx of Nazi stormtroopers. But it was a dispute he couldn't win. Hitler's half-sister turned to Adolf's chief secretary, Martin Bormann. The innkeeper was sent to the Dachau concentration camp.
They sent a taxi to collect my father. It was terrible. I'll never forget how my mother laid down in front of the taxi.
Resistance was futile. After 3 weeks in Dachau, the innkeeper was forced to sell his hotel and leave. Angela Raubel personally oversaw the eviction. Angela wasn't the only one to take advantage of Adolf's power. Hitler's half-brother, Alois, was a bigamist. His first marriage to Irish woman Bridget Dowling produced a son, William Patrick Hitler.
Oh, okay.
When Hitler became famous, William Patrick sold the family story to the international press.
Thank you very much.
A furious Hitler called him an obnoxious relative, my loathsome nephew. I am just one step away from the very top. I could even become chancellor, and then my own family destroys me. Despite the potentially damaging stories spread by his loathsome nephew, Hitler became chancellor in 1933. His obnoxious relative soon made the most of his uncle's newfound power.
Here's this nephew named Willy Hitler living in London. His uncle becomes Chancellor of Germany. Within months, Willy shows up in Berlin, basically playing off the Hitler name.
William Patrick Hitler was a scoundrel. He was an opportunist. He exploited his name, his tenuous connections with Hitler for profit.
In London, the surname Hitler was a hindrance. But in his uncle's Reich, William Patrick put it to his advantage.
I got to know him as William Patrick Hitler, and for me, he was called Herr Hitler. That was all. A polite address. I really wouldn't describe him as an intellectual person. He was small-minded, didn't have a very good education, and didn't have a good knowledge base.
Despite the trouble he had caused, Hitler helped his nephew get a government job as an accountant. But William Patrick wanted more. and threatened to blackmail his uncle by leaking more damaging stories to the British press.
It was a blatant act of blackmail on Willie's part, and the most astonishing thing is that it worked.
Hitler secured a new job for his loathsome nephew as a salesman at an Opel car factory. For 6 years, William Patrick lived an easy life in his uncle's Reich. His father, the bigamist, Hitler's half-brother Alois, also cashed in on the family name. He opened a restaurant, Alois, at the Wittenbergplatz in the heart of Berlin. Word soon spread, and Alois became a hangout for the rising stars of the Nazi establishment. Heil Hitler, Herr Hitler, said guests to the proprietor. In 1937, Alois wanted to extend his business, but the Jewish house owner was against his plans. Hitler's half-brother wrote a letter to the only union allowed to operate, the Nazi-controlled German Work Front. The time of the Jewish ruling powers in house ownership should have found an end. The intimidation worked. The Jewish owner fled into Holland. Alois could extend his restaurant, thanks to the influence he enjoyed as a result of his half-brother Adolf's all-powerful political might. Austria was annexed in March 1938. Hitler triumphantly returned to his homeland. Hitler's homeland in Lower Austria's Waldviertel was declared the Führer's Ahnengau, or Ancestors District. Propaganda newsreels showed rustic villages festooned with Nazi flags.
Der aus dem 12. Jahrhundert stammenden Marktgemeinde Döllersheim wurden die Großmutter und der Vater unseres Führers geboren.
But the Führer seemed less enthusiastic about the rural backwater where his ancestors had worked in the fields and intermarried.
Hitler wasn't really that keen on all this fuss and didn't support it in any way. He really only travelled through this part of Lower Austria once. He didn't even stop.
Nazi ideology made much of blood and soil, but Hitler ignored the rural Austrian soil of his own ancestry. His old homeland became a military training area. War loomed on the horizon, and having enjoyed the good life in Nazi Germany for 6 years, Hitler's loathsome nephew, William Patrick, made his escape. In February 1939, he arrived in New York with his mother. Once again, he turned on his uncle Adolf when it suited him.
I believe that Hitler's policy in Europe will not bring any benefit to the human race at all.
It was a staggering turnaround for the man who blackmailed his uncle for favors in Germany.
I hope that the American people in this country will not be kidded by my moustache, because after all, my heart is in the right place. That's the main thing.
Willie's mother wrote a book, My Brother-in-Law Adolf Hitler, and William Patrick embarked on a lecture tour about his uncle Adolf. In an interview with the popular Look magazine, William Patrick styled himself as a victim, when in reality his uncle had helped him get work and influence in Nazi Germany. At first, there was intense interest in what he had to say, even among American Jews. William Patrick was welcomed into Chicago's well-known Anshe Emet synagogue. He promised insights into the German psyche, but ultimately failed to deliver. People were no longer interested in what Hitler's nephew had to say. William Patrick wrote to the president that he wanted to join in the fight against Nazi Germany. The FBI was suspicious, but eventually Hitler's nephew was cleared to join the US Navy in 1944.
It is Der Fuhrer's nephew, William Patrick Hitler, 32, who came here from England 5 years ago. This will break Uncle Schickeldruber's heart.
As a member of the armed forces, I hope to take an active part in the liquidation of this man, my uncle, who has unleashed such misery upon the world.
But William Patrick's wartime service was limited. Apart from playing a minor propaganda role, he was enlisted as a Navy seaman for just 2 years before fading into obscurity.
Because he had left Germany before the Second World War, because he was not there during the period of the worst Nazi atrocities, he couldn't really shed any light on that. And his utility faded away. What he had to say was actually overshadowed by what people later learned about Hitler's activity, the atrocities committed by the Third Reich. And because he hadn't been there, he really had nothing to add to the record, and he just faded into oblivion.
While William Patrick played no real part in the war, another of Hitler's nephews was plunged into the worst of it, the dreaded Eastern Front. It was another son of his half-brother Alois, but from his other wife, Hedwig. Heinz Hitler served as a signals NCO in an artillery regiment in the war against the Soviet Union. Unlike William Patrick, it seems that Heinz Hitler did not want preferential treatment. It was a dangerous job. His family was only too aware that his name could also put him in danger.
I know that Mammy and Pappy always said they didn't really want him to go to the front. And I think not even Adolf Hitler was very happy about him going to the front.
Heinz Hitler carried on regardless, until he went missing on a winter's evening in January 1942. He was captured by the Red Army and transferred to Moscow's infamous Butyrka prison.
They knew he was a relative of Hitler, so obviously he didn't receive good treatment. He was interrogated rather brutally. Some reports say that he was tortured as well.
Hitler's nephew died in captivity shortly after. The Eastern Front collapsed, and by April 1945, a rampant Red Army had smashed its way into Lower Austria and Hitler's so-called Ancestors District. Russian forces were ruthless.
What they did was they kind of wrecked it. They turned it into a military camp, and they sent all the settlers away from the area. So in other words, they didn't want some kind of shrine building up here towards Hitler after the defeat. So they sort of despoiled it, got rid of it, and removed all the people who lived there.
One of those people was teenager Josef Poinstinger.
We thought we were going to be shot, and we were to dig our own graves beforehand.
But the Russians had other plans. The captives were taken to the Döllersheim cemetery, where a cenotaph had been dedicated to Hitler's grandmother.
They took us to Hitler's grandmother Schickeldruber's cenotaph. Well, we had to get rid of it.
The Russians seemed to be looking for something, but only fragments of wood and a pile of bones were uncovered.
The officers came and searched among the bones again and again, but we didn't know what they wanted.
They were digging in the wrong spot. The cenotaph was an honorary marker. The real remains of Hitler's grandmother lay elsewhere. The Russians eventually stopped the digging up of Döllersheim cemetery.
Because they didn't find anything, the Russian captain said, in Russian, "You old whore, let the devil take you." That's what he said. "You old whore, let the devil take you."
It wasn't only the dead the Russians were interested in. They were determined to hunt down any living relatives of Adolf Hitler.
Anybody connected with Hitler, a relative or a half-brother's uncle's niece or whatever it is, anybody obscure even, is on the hit list. When the Russians arrive in Lower Austria, they pretty much do to that part of the world what they've been doing all the time as they made their way slowly west, or sometimes quickly west. They raped, they pillaged, and they basically terrorized the population. Now, many Russians today will, of course, deny that the Russian army was quite that brutal, but I think we can be very certain in places such as Berlin, we know famously, and also in Lower Austria, that the local population were terrorized. And I think you've still got people today who, you know, speak of those times in a total sense of fear.
One of those still traumatized is Hitler's distant cousin, Adolf Koppensteiner. An accordion was one of few childhood comforts left after the Russians arrived on the family farm.
My father and my mother never did anyone any harm. My father was very afraid of the Russians. They dug a big hollow in front of the house. I was there with them. That's where they wanted to hide.
This family photograph was taken just 7 days before the Red Army arrived in Lower Austria. The Russians looted the Koppensteiners' farm, slaughtered the livestock, and took the parents away.
The Russians said that my parents just had to give a statement, but we knew they would never come back.
He says his father, Ignaz Koppensteiner, and his mother, Maria, were interrogated until they admitted they were partly to blame for the Second World War. He says they were sentenced to 25 years hard labor, but never came home.
We lived in hope that they might one day return, but they didn't. Not a single note, no news. We didn't hear anything.
It was a long time ago, but vivid nightmares haunt Adolf Koppensteiner to this day.
To be honest, I still get scared. I'm still frightened, even today. Why? Because you never know what's coming.
Even a distant relative who played no part in Nazi crimes continues to pay a heavy price for Hitler's war. Adolf Hitler left his relatives and the German people to their own fate as the Red Army closed in on the shattered remains of his greater German Reich. Shortly before the end, in April 1945, Hitler delivered a final order for his assistant Julius Schaub. He was to destroy all of Hitler's private documents. It meant a trip to the Bavarian Alps and Hitler's Berghof, the holiday home that became a headquarters and seat of power near Berchtesgaden. It was surrounded by barracks and houses used by the Nazi elite, and at that time had been spared from the ravages of war. Inside Hitler's Berghof, Schaub emptied the safes and destroyed anything that contained clues about the dictator's private life, including his family. The American 7th Infantry Division was the first to reach Berchtesgaden. Various people close to Hitler were tracked down and interviewed, including his younger sister Paula. Following his wishes, Hitler's full sister Paula had lived under the pseudonym Paula Wolf in Vienna. He had evacuated her to the Alps in the last days of the war. She ended up in a small two-room apartment near the train station.
She was investigated, she was interrogated, she told Allied intelligence whatever it was she knew. She was a pretty small fry. She bore the name Hitler, she was related to Hitler, but she was not an important figure in the day-to-day operations of the Third Reich.
In the late 1950s, American Army press officer Jasper Boone scored a rare interview with Hitler's sister. He was stationed at Hitler's former office in Berchtesgaden. The Nazi eagle, minus the swastika, is still perched over the front door today. Boone offered to introduce Paula to a rare survivor, a veteran of the Great War who had fought with her brother Adolf in return for a meeting. She signed her agreement, Paula Hitler. Hitler's full sister did not express any remorse.
She said, it was my brother's idea to do the Autobahn. My brother kept Germany from becoming communist. The Volkswagen was his idea. He put people to work because we were in the midst of a deep depression. And she said, you got to remember, Napoleon was one of the most hated men of his era. But now he's a national hero and written up in books as such. How do you know the same thing won't happen to my brother?
She claimed others were to blame for Nazi war crimes.
She also said that she really didn't think her brother was responsible for all the atrocities of World War II, particularly the annihilation or extinction of the Jews. That she thought Himmler and others of his staff were far more efficient than her brother ever expected them to be.
Paula Hitler was engaged to a man who committed some of the many Nazi atrocities perpetrated under her brother's regime. Dr. Erwin Jekelius was a senior consultant at the Viennese psychiatric institution Am Steinhof. It is the same clinic where Hitler's schizophrenic cousin Aloysia Veit was locked away for many years before she was gassed in the Nazi euthanasia program. Paula Hitler's fiancé was a willing participant. He sent more than 4,000 sick people to the gas chambers. Exactly what Paula knew of these mass killings is a mystery. If she did know about them, it didn't put her off. It was her controlling brother who put a stop to the marriage. Hitler ordered the Gestapo to send Dr. Jekelius to the Eastern Front. He was captured and died in Soviet captivity in 1952. As for Paula, she was allowed to live out her days in relative comfort, surviving on social security benefits in her brother Adolf's favorite Alpine spa town.
The Nazis had a law, didn't they? The kinship law, which meant if you were arrested, all your family got drawn in as well. So there were many people who would say, well, she shouldn't have been able to live out a quiet life in that way, when many other people went to concentration camps under Hitler's rule. But really, as the US authorities showed, she was a pretty harmless figure, really. She hadn't had the great involvement in any of the crimes of the Third Reich, and so really, do you blame the sort of sister for the crimes of the brother? It's always a difficult one, isn't it?
Across the Atlantic, Hitler's bloodline survived and thrived. The loathsome nephew, William Patrick, disappeared after his service with the US Navy ended in 1946. Many years on, his family was traced to Long Island, New York.
The fact that he disappeared into oblivion after the Second World War is, I think, the result of the fact that he was deeply uninteresting, not terribly clever, and once his utility for propaganda purposes has ended, he was a pretty unimportant figure.
William Patrick became Willie, an American citizen. He took the trouble to change his name to Patrick Stewart Houston, but still called his first son Alexander Adolf. He had 4 sons with his German wife, Phyllis. She was determined to protect the family from the name that became a curse.
I don't want to use the word secretive, but they more or less stayed by themselves. She was friendly, but there was always that line that you didn't cross, I felt. You didn't ask her too many things, you know.
The family settled in a small town on Long Island, New York. In Nazi Germany, William Patrick relied on his uncle Adolf to get him jobs. In America, it was up to him to find extra ways to earn money.
They had either 2 or 3, I think it was 3 patients from the hospital. They were veterans of World War II. And most of them were I guess shell shock patients, mental patients or whatever. And they had room and board there at the Stewart Houston home.
Later on, Willie operated a private blood laboratory from his house. Premarital blood testing was once a legal requirement in New York State. Many couples unwittingly had their blood tests done by a Hitler. Many years later, the Stewart Houston's neighbors found out who they really were.
Well, I was pretty shocked, to tell you the truth. But it answered a lot of questions, you know, as they sort of stayed to themselves a lot, you know. But I felt so sorry, mostly for the children, you know. And it was a secret that they had to keep, and I felt very badly for them.
Today, William Patrick Hitler's sons live anonymously in America. 2 of them are landscape gardeners, the 3rd a social worker. They don't have any children. Any attempts to talk to them about the past have failed. William Patrick Hitler died on Long Island in 1987. His father, Alois, died in 1956 and was buried together with Hedwig, Erna, and Hans Hitler in Hamburg. Hitler's half-sister, Angela Raubel, died in 1949 near Munich. She had 2 children and 6 grandchildren. Paula Hitler died in 1960 near Berchtesgaden without descendants. Today, Adolf Hitler's relatives still walk the streets of Long Island, New York, Germany, and Austria. But lawyers block any kind of contact. They don't want to talk about their family history. They're among millions still affected by the murderous reign of their ancestor, perhaps the most notorious criminal in history, Adolf Hitler.